I was standing near the very back of the crowd, just another face among hundreds gathered on the Capitol lawn for the National Veterans Unity Ceremony. The sun was sharp overhead. Flags snapped in the breeze. Cameras panned slowly across rows of decorated soldiers' medals, gleaming, postures rigid, families clapping in reverence. I wore a navy blue blazer. Civilian. Purposefully plain, no rank on my chest. No uniform to give me away. A folding chair near the sound booth had my name on it, handwritten, misspelled. Typical. I didn't correct it. I had no intention of being seen. That was always the plan. For 15 years, I served in shadows where headlines don't reach and names are erased before they're ever written. My family thought I worked at a desk. Just data, reports, whatever. They had no idea I'd spent the better part of a decade chasing ghosts across continents, calling strikes that never made the news, and extracting agents no one could admit existed. Then the declassification order came. And today, at this ceremony televised live to millions, I was about to be revealed to the world. But even I wasn't prepared for what came next. The president stepped up to the podium. His voice echoed through the loudspeakers, solemn and practiced. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," he said, "there is one final honor. One name that, until today, could not be spoken. A soldier whose identity was protected for national security. Until now." My pulse stopped. In recognition of Operation Iron Veil, and for 15 years of extraordinary service to the United States of America, we honor Major General Loren Hart, CIA Special Operations Command. I heard it before I felt it. The silence. Then the cameras turned. And in that moment, my name shattered every lie, every dismissal, every assumption. My family's faces froze. My father stood slowly, lips parted. One brother sat paralyzed, the other looked away. They had always called me a civilian. But today, the entire country knew better. My name is Loren Hart. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in Colorado Springs, where military uniforms are just as common as school backpacks, and legacy matters more than almost anything else. In my family, the Hart name was more than a last name. It was a code. A symbol of service. My grandfather served in Korea. My father, a Marine colonel, spent over 3 decades commanding units across 4 continents. My 2 older brothers? Both Army Rangers. Both decorated. Both walking, talking tributes to the proper way to serve. I was the youngest. And the only daughter. By the time I was 8, I had already memorized every rank insignia in the Marine Corps. I could recite the Pledge of Allegiance backward and forward. I learned early that patriotism wasn't a choice in our house, it was an expectation, especially for someone named Hart. But from the beginning, I loved differently. I wasn't drawn to the battlefield or the weapons. I was drawn to patterns, language, signals, the quiet tension in what people don't say. I loved puzzles, codes, and tracing threads through chaos. I wanted to serve, yes, but not like them. I wanted to see behind the curtain to protect lives before battles even started. So, while my brothers marched into ROTC and officer training, I applied to Yale, dual major in linguistics and political science. I interned at Langley at 21, joined the CIA at 23. By 26, I was deep inside the Special Activities Center, country's most covert operations unit. But none of that mattered at home. At home, I was still just the civilian. When I declined a spot in the Army like my brothers, my father looked me in the eyes and said, "Just don't expect a seat at the table if you're not willing to wear the uniform." What he didn't understand was that I wore a different kind of uniform, one that didn't come with medals or ceremonies, one that meant erasing your name from records, one that came with the knowledge that failure wasn't just personal, it was geopolitical. While my family toasted medals and deployments, I was slipping into war zones under alias passports. While they clinked whiskey glasses over field promotions, I was tracing arms shipments across borderless regions, coordinating strikes that had to succeed quietly or entire cities would suffer. But I couldn't say a word. Not at birthdays. Not on Christmas Eve. Not even when my intelligence saved my brother's unit from an ambush in Kandahar. I watched his face on television as he gave credit to flawless air support, and I swallowed the irony like I'd swallowed it 100 times before. That was the life I chose. Quiet service. Invisible valor. And for 15 years, I told myself that was enough. Until one day, it wasn't. The first time I realized my family didn't take my path seriously, I was 24. It was Thanksgiving. My first holiday home since joining the agency. I had just returned from an assignment in Eastern Europe, weeks spent living under a false name, gathering intel that had directly prevented a cross-border weapons deal. I couldn't say a word about any of it, of course. So I showed up with a smile, handed over a bottle of wine, and sat quietly as the stories began. My oldest brother, Kyle, was halfway through his second deployment. He regaled everyone with a tale about a desert convoy and a blown tire under fire. My other brother, Chris, added color commentary about Ranger School like it was a summer retreat for heroes. Dad beamed through it all, pride practically radiating from his uniformed posture even though he was already retired. Then came the inevitable question. "So, Lauren," Kyle asked across the table, between bites of stuffing, "you still doing your analysis thing?" I nodded. Yup, still in intelligence. Dad didn't look up from carving the turkey. "Support staff matters too," he muttered, a phrase I would come to hear more times than I could count. Chris chuckled. "Must be nice. Weekends off. Climate control." Meanwhile, we're sweating bullets in a tent the size of a closet. Mom, ever the peacekeeper, tried to steer the conversation toward dessert, but the damage was already done. They didn't see me. Not really. Not as someone who served. Not as someone who bled the same for the flag. That wasn't the last time. At every gathering after that, I was the one helping in the kitchen. The one fielding awkward questions from distant relatives like, "So, when are you going to settle down and get a real job?" Or worse, "Still working in admin?" I remember the look on Dad's face when I mentioned my latest promotion. I had just been elevated to deputy mission lead for a high-risk global task force. He gave a polite smile and said, "That's nice, honey. You know, Chris just got selected for officer school. Big deal. Proud of him." No eye contact, no questions, no pause. At one point, I started wondering if they genuinely believed I was just a glorified typist. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't that they didn't value service. They just didn't understand any version of it that didn't look like theirs. If I wasn't in camo, in a convoy, or cleaning a rifle, it wasn't real. I tried not to let it sink in. I reminded myself that secrecy was part of the job. That invisibility was the cost. But still it chipped away at something. Quietly, constantly. Especially when your own father, a man who once told you service was sacred, couldn't bring himself to say the words, "I'm proud of you." Instead, he'd say, "Be careful with those reports. I hear paper cuts are brutal." And the worst part? He meant it as a joke. But to me, it was a punch that never quite stopped bruising. My first operation wasn't glamorous. It was a dusty outpost on the outskirts of Erbil, northern Iraq. I'd been in country less than 48 hours. No flag. No unit patch. No recognition. Just a code name, a satellite phone, and a back-channel connection to Langley that cut out every 3 minutes. My job? Intercept an arms dealer known only by the code name Seraph. He moved through mosques, wedding halls, refugee camps, anywhere the desperate gathered. He wasn't on any public list, but we knew his weapons were responsible for at least 5 attacks on U.S. bases in the region. I remember watching him from a market rooftop. Sweat dripping down my back, earpiece buzzing. One wrong move and a child could die. One delayed call and an asset could be burned. It wasn't combat the way my brothers defined it, but the stakes were no less deadly. And that was just the beginning. In the years that followed, I traveled under at least 6 different aliases across more countries than I can count. I embedded with local informants in Jordan. I coordinated drone strikes over Somalia. I once pulled a field operative out of Belarus using nothing but a forged passport, 2 burner phones, and a box of pastries that happened to hide a signal jammer. But I never got to tell anyone. There were no welcome home banners, no family waiting at the airport, no stories shared at barbecues or medals pinned in front of proud parents. Instead, I'd land at Dulles in the middle of the night, hand over a black satchel of hard drives, sign a silence clause, and disappear into another alias. I lived my 20s between time zones and lies. I missed birthdays, weddings, funerals. I watched my nephews grow up through mailed school photos. My mother once said, "You work too much. You'll regret it when you're older." What she didn't know was that I spent my 30th birthday undercover in Istanbul, eating stale protein bars in a safe house while coordinating an extraction that saved the lives of 3 American diplomats. She thought I was in a hotel for a policy conference. I let her believe it. Because that was the job. To be invisible. To sacrifice recognition for results. And in the silence that followed every mission, I had to find validation in the work itself, not in praise, not in headlines, and certainly not from my family. And still, somehow, the hardest part wasn't the danger, or the lies, or the isolation. It was knowing that no matter what I did, no matter how many lives I saved, my father would still introduce me at parties as, "My daughter Lauren, she works in admin, something with the government." And I'd smile. Every time. Because what I did wasn't about being seen. It was about keeping others safe even when they had no idea who they were being protected by. Even when they were my own family. Holidays were always a big deal in the Hart family. Thanksgiving was military-grade organized planners, prep lists, seating charts. Christmas involved matching pajamas, a 10-foot tree, and a rotating playlist of Bing Crosby and Marine Corps choirs. Even 4th of July meant red, white, and blue everything, a backyard grill, and Dad reading the Declaration of Independence like it was scripture. But somewhere along the way, my name stopped being part of the plan. It wasn't malicious at first, just subtle. One year, I got the group text for Thanksgiving, 2 hours before dinner. The next, I got left out of the Secret Santa draw because, as my mom put it, we just assumed you'd be too busy with whatever it is you do. She said it kindly, like she was giving me an out. But I didn't need an out. I needed a place at the table. There was a year I flew in from Brussels, 30 hours of no sleep, a stomach full of airport, coffee, and jet lag. I arrived at my childhood home just as the family was finishing dessert. No one had set a plate for me. No one asked if I wanted to join the game of charades. My father raised an eyebrow and said, "Didn't think you'd actually make it. You always miss these things." And in that moment, I realized something painful. They weren't angry that I was off and gone. They had simply adjusted to life without me. I had become optional, an afterthought. Even the mantle over the fireplace told the story. Framed photos of Kyle in uniform, Chris and his Bronze Star, my dad's retirement plaque, a proud little shrine to the family's military legacy. There was no photo of me. No mention of the daughter who once spent 3 straight months embedded in enemy territory. Just a gap. An absence so quiet it almost felt intentional. And yet, every time I came home, I played the role. I peeled potatoes. I watched nieces unwrap gifts. I nodded politely when someone cracked a joke about me being the family spook. I never pushed back. Never corrected anyone. Because how do you explain that the reason you missed Thanksgiving wasn't because you didn't care, but because you were coordinating a drone strike to save a kidnapped aid worker in northern Syria? How do you say, "Sorry, I missed Easter. I was running surveillance in Caracas while a diplomat's child was being held for ransom"? You don't. You just smile. You say, "Work's been busy." You sip your wine. You swallow the ache. And then you go home, alone, to an apartment filled with classified files and burner phones, wondering if maybe this year will be the last time you try. Because there's a specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being physically alone, but from sitting at a table surrounded by people you love and realizing that not a single one of them truly sees you. Not really. Not yet. The call came just past midnight, somewhere between Jakarta and Manila. I had just stepped off a cargo plane, sweat, soaked, exhausted, my earpiece still buzzing with encrypted chatter. We had spent the past 72 hours chasing rumors of a chemical weapons lab buried beneath a fake shipping company. The intel was volatile, the timeline tighter than I liked. My head was still full of maps and aliases when the secure line rang. It was Chris. His voice was flat, numb. Lauren. It's Mom. She had a stroke. It was massive. She didn't make it. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. He kept talking details, arrangements, who was flying in, what flowers she loved. I barely heard him. It was like the world had slowed, distorted by grief and disbelief, but also by duty. Because the moment I hung up, another call came. Langley. Mission parameters had changed. The lab was confirmed. I was the only asset in position with operational clearance and language fluency. The extraction window was 72 hours, and we wouldn't get another shot. I had a choice. Go home to bury my mother, or stay and prevent what could become another mass casualty crisis. There was no time for sentiment. I chose the mission. I didn't cry. I didn't allow myself the luxury. I swallowed the ache, armored it with focus, and carried on because that's what I had been trained to do. Compartmentalize. Prioritize. Endure. 3 days later, while my family gathered in our hometown church beneath warm lights and soft hymns, I was deep underground, guiding a Black Ops team through a maze of tunnels laced with tripwires. The intel we recovered that day stopped a biochemical plot aimed at a major international airport. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lives were saved. But all my father saw was an empty seat in the front pew. When I finally called, 4 days after the funeral, he answered on the first ring. No greeting. No softness. You weren't there. I said nothing at first. Then, I know. I'm sorry, Dad. He cut me off. She was your mother. She asked for you in the hospital. She was scared. She didn't understand why you weren't coming. I was working, I said, quietly. Working. He repeated, bitter. Always working. You've spent your whole life chasing some ghost of service while forgetting the people who love you. His voice cracked. Just once. And then, click, the line went dead. And with it, something inside me dimmed. Not because I regretted the choice, I would make it again. I know what we prevented. I know the cost. But because I knew, in that moment, that no matter what I did, no matter how many lives I saved, how many medals I earned or operations I led, I would never be enough for him. Not in the way he needed. Not in the way he defined service. I didn't just lose my mother that week. I lost my place in the family. And this time, it wasn't something I could fix with silence. It started with a call from a number that didn't exist. Blocked, encrypted, untraceable. I was in Berlin, finishing up a quiet transfer of surveillance data between embassy zone of those transactions that didn't officially happen. I had just stepped out of a secure room, peeled off latex gloves, and was halfway through a stale protein bar when my secure phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was crisp, commanding. Agent Hart, this is Director Cole from Langley. I straightened instinctively, muscles tensing before my mind even caught up. Yes, sir. I'm calling about Operation Blackridge, he said. My breath caught. That wasn't a name I heard often, not even inside the agency. That code name had been sealed under a presidential executive order for over a decade. The kind of file you needed 4 clearances just to open. Yes, sir. I repeated, slower this time. The operation has been reevaluated by the Joint Intelligence Committee, he continued. Your role has been reviewed. The decision has been made to declassify the mission for public recognition. Silence. It rang louder than any explosion I'd ever heard. I'm sorry, sir? Declassify? Effective immediately, he confirmed. You've been nominated for the Presidential Medal of Merit. The announcement will be made during this year's National Veterans Unity Ceremony. You'll be honored publicly, and your name will be cleared for official record. I stared out the hotel window at the frozen city beyond the glass. Snowflakes drifted across rooftops like static. I hadn't heard my real name spoken with that kind of weight in years. And now, it would be broadcast to the world. Why now? I asked. Because it's time, he said. Because the country needs to remember that service comes in many forms and yours has gone unseen for too long. I hung up slowly, the words echoing in my chest long after the line went dead. For 15 years, I had served in silence. In disguise, my life was a code, my purpose a secret. I had missed every milestone that could anchor someone to the world: birthdays, graduations, my own mother's funeral. And now, suddenly, I was about to be seen. I wasn't ready. Recognition sounds noble until you realize what it really means: vulnerability, exposure, questions, reactions, and the possibility that the people who once dismissed you still might not understand even when told the truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, my heart beat louder than the traffic outside. My family didn't know. They thought I still worked somewhere in policy support. Chris once joked I probably just managed filing systems at some boring embassy. Dad hadn't said my name in 2 years. What would they think, watching from their living room, when my face appeared on national television? When the President of the United States said my name out loud? When the daughter they thought they lost turned out to be one of the country's most decorated covert operatives? It wasn't pride I felt. It was something deeper, heavier, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you have to jump but also knowing the fall won't be clean. You don't spend 15 years building walls without consequence. And when they come down, people get hurt. I had 3 weeks until the ceremony. That's how long I had to decide whether I'd tell them. My father, my brothers, the family that believed I was some kind of overworked administrative assistant with a security badge. The people who hadn't seen me for who I really was since the day I graduated from Yale and didn't commission into the military. I could have called, sent a message, offered some kind of warning, maybe softened the blow. But the truth? I didn't want to. Not this time. For 15 years, I had protected the country in silence. For 15 years, I'd let them diminish what I did because I couldn't speak up. Because "I'm proud of you" wasn't something they said unless it came with camouflage, medals, or the smell of gunpowder. And now, for the first time in my life, I had clearance. I had facts. I had the stage. But I still chose silence. Not out of revenge, though part of me wished it were that simple. No, this wasn't about vengeance. This was about timing. About impact. About letting the truth do what words never could. Because some things are only understood when seen. And I needed them to see me. So I went quiet. I declined family calls with vague excuses, traveling a lot lately. I didn't respond to the group text about who was bringing dessert to the post-ceremony family dinner. I didn't correct Dad when he told a family friend that I was working in some kind of global logistics team. I just waited. And while I waited, I prepared. My dress uniform hadn't seen the light of day in years. I had it steamed, pressed, inspected down to the smallest stitch. Every ribbon, every insignia, every detail aligned with precision. I memorized the seating protocol. I rehearsed the path I would take to the stage when my name was called. But I also kept one thing hidden: my rank insignia. That morning, as I stood in front of the mirror at my hotel, I slipped a soft black coat over the full uniform. The stars on my shoulders disappeared beneath its collar. I looked like any other guest, any other woman attending the ceremony out of quiet support. And that was the point. I arrived alone, just as the sun was rising over the Capitol lawn. I stood in line with civilians, accepted my guest badge without correction, and took my seat in the back row of the reserved section. I could see my father a dozen rows ahead, sitting ramrod straight, dressed in his retired colonel's uniform. My brothers flanked him, Chris in full dress, Kyle snapping a photo of the podium. Not one of them turned around. Not one of them looked for me. And still, I stayed silent. Because what was coming wasn't something I could explain over a phone call, or in a message, or in a late-night confession. What was coming had to land. It had to knock the wind out of them. Not to punish, but to awaken. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't shouted, or argued, or defended. Sometimes it's the one that arrives quietly, carried by posture, by silence, by the weight of 15 invisible years. The ceremony was already halfway through when I began to feel it, the tightening air, the way time seems to coil before it snaps. Rows of uniforms, medals glinting under bright white lights. A symphony orchestra version of the national anthem still hung in the corners of the auditorium, echoing like a memory. I sat perfectly still, in my seat near the edge of the aisle, coat still buttoned to the collar. Unseen, unremarkable, until I wasn't. The president stepped to the podium. Cameras swiveled. The entire room hushed with automatic reverence. Flashbulbs faded. Silence took its place. And then he said, "Before we conclude today's ceremony, there is one final recognition. One name that, until today, could not be spoken publicly." My stomach turned to stone. One individual whose work has prevented unspeakable tragedies, whose identity has remained hidden in service of national security, but whose contribution demands acknowledgement now and forever. Ender. The president paused. He looked down at the card in his hand, but I saw it. The glint in his eyes. He already knew the moment he was about to create. For 15 years of distinguished service in covert operations, and for her leadership in Operation Blackridge, which saved thousands of lives today, we honor Major General Lauren Hart, CIA Special Activities Division. Gasps. Audible. Sharp. Some were caught mid-breath. Then came the shift, hundreds of heads turning. Toward me. I stood. In a single motion, I unbuttoned the coat and slid it from my shoulders. The rows of stars gleamed on my uniform, visible now under the bright lights. My ribbons caught the shine. My nameplate glinted, and the room moved first into applause, then into a standing ovation. Not polite, not routine. This was visceral, raw. Applause that roared up the walls and shook the stage. Applause from generals, commanders, veterans, people who knew what the codename Blackridge meant. What it cost. But, in the front row, 3 people remained seated. My father, Kyle, Chris. My brothers stared at me like they didn't recognize what they were seeing. My father's mouth parted slightly, stunned not just by the name, but by the uniform, by the rank, by the fact that I outranked every man in my family. I walked slowly toward the stage. No smile, no swagger, just purpose, gravity. Because this wasn't revenge. This was truth finally stepping into daylight. The president extended his hand. I took it. "Welcome home, General Hart," he said, the microphone catching every syllable. "We're grateful to finally be able to say your name." He pinned the medal to my chest. I felt its weight not just in metal, but in memory. The years of being talked over. The dinners where no one asked me what I did. The birthdays missed, the missions buried, the silence endured. Now, broken. When I turned to face the crowd, their faces were blurred behind the lights. But my family's weren't. They were clear, undeniably still, undeniably shaken. And for the first time in 15 years, I was no longer invisible. The reception hall hummed with polite laughter, champagne glasses clinking over polished marble floors. People milled around in perfectly tailored suits and uniforms, exchanging congratulations in clipped, practiced tones. But I wasn't listening. I was watching the door. And when it opened, when I saw him stride in, flanked by my brothers, eyes locked on me, I knew we were finally here. The moment after the explosion. The dust still settling. My father reached me first. He stood tall, his back as straight as ever, but something in his eyes had shifted, like a mirror cracking in slow motion. "Major General," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth. I nodded once, Colonel. A long pause. Then Chris stepped in, his tone clipped and defensive. You outranked all of us, this whole time. It wasn't about rank, I replied. Wasn't it? Kyle snapped. 15 years. You let us joke. You let us mock you. You never said a word. I wasn't allowed to, I said, voice low. You think I enjoyed hearing your assumptions? That I wanted to keep silent while you dismissed what I did? I followed protocol. Chris scoffed. You followed pride. That did it. I took a breath and met his eyes sharp, steady. No, I said. I followed duty. And while you were posting pictures from base camp and shaking hands with generals, I was in back alleys gathering intel that kept your platoons alive. Do you remember the ambush in Kandahar? The one you barely made it out of? He blinked. I ran the op that fed you the intel to reroute. You're standing here because of a call I made in the middle of the night, but I didn't tell you. I couldn't. And you never thought to ask. They went quiet. And then my father spoke softer than I'd ever heard. I thought you didn't care. I turned to him. You never asked me what I did, Dad. You assumed I'd chosen the easy way. You assumed that because I didn't wear your uniform, I wasn't serving. He looked down at his hands that had polished brass and packed bags for deployments. Hands that had once lifted me onto his shoulders before I became a woman he couldn't quite understand. I was proud of your brothers, he whispered, but I didn't know how to be proud of you. The room around us disappeared. I didn't need your pride, I said. I needed your belief, your respect, even if you didn't understand. Kyle crossed his arms, eyes tight. Why didn't you tell us when you finally could? I paused. Because by then, I'd already accepted that you didn't want to know. And maybe I was tired of trying to prove myself to a room that never left a seat for me. Silence again. But this one was different. Not rejection. Not resistance. Something else. Recognition. Raw and reluctant, but real. My father nodded slowly. Well, he said, you earned it. All of it. And though the words were simple, they landed like thunder. The next morning, the house was quiet. Not strained, not cold, just quiet in a way that felt different. Like the silence after a storm, when the wind has finally run out of reasons to scream. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching the sunlight creep across the edge of my childhood backyard. The same swing set was still there, rusted at the corners, the same patch of grass that Kyle used to mow into football field lines. Familiar, but older. Weathered. Like us. Dad joined me without a word. Just sat down slowly in the chair beside mine. He didn't wear his uniform today, just a soft, faded sweatshirt and jeans. His hands clasped together like they didn't quite know what to do now that there wasn't a rank to salute. We sat like that for a long time. Then he said, I Googled Operation Blackridge last night. Not much came up. Just a lot of redacted briefings and speculation. I smiled faintly. That's kind of the point. He nodded. Still, I saw enough to realize we had no idea what you were carrying. No, I said. You didn't. Another pause. Then, I'm sorry I never asked. I should have trusted that your way of serving was just as valid as ours. Maybe more. I didn't respond right away, because it wasn't just about hearing the words, it was about believing he meant them. And I did. For the first time, I did. Inside, Mom was making breakfast. She'd pulled out my favorite mug, the one I used to sneak tea into during high school. She didn't say much either, but she did set an extra place for me at the table, next to hers. Not at the edge, not out of view, beside her. Later that afternoon, Chris came by with his kids. They ran up the front steps like nothing had changed, and maybe that was the greatest comfort of all, that the little ones still saw Aunt Lauren before Major General, that the medals didn't matter to them, only that I was present, laughing, real. Kyle arrived just before dinner, wearing the same sheepish look he used to have when he broke Dad's lawnmower. He handed me a beer and didn't try to say much. Until he did. You know, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. For years I thought I had you figured out, like you just didn't want to push yourself. Thought maybe you were hiding from the hard stuff. "And now?" I asked gently. He looked at me. "Now I know. You just never needed to be seen to be strong." And that landed deeper than I expected. That night, we sat around the same dining room table where I'd once felt invisible. Only now, the conversation flowed differently. They asked questions not just out of curiosity, but out of respect. I answered what I could, and when I couldn't, they didn't press. There was space, room, a shared language slowly forming. We weren't a perfect family, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I wasn't translating myself to fit their expectations. I was just me. And that was finally enough. Some truths you don't learn in training. They're not covered in orientation packets or debriefing sessions. They're not etched into medals or whispered in mission briefings. They arrive slowly, over years. In silence, in sacrifice. In the quiet weight of choosing a path no one applauds, at least, not right away. For most of my life, I thought value had to be witnessed to be real. That if no one saw what I did, it couldn't matter. That if the people I loved couldn't recognize my contribution, then maybe it wasn't enough. But I was wrong. The truth is, not all service is loud. Not all courage is decorated. And not all strength is seen. Sometimes, strength is choosing to keep going when no one claps. Sometimes, value is doing the right thing even when it costs you presents at your mother's funeral or a photo on the family wall. And sometimes, purpose is showing up for a country that may never know your name. There is a kind of freedom that comes with being known. But there's also a different kind of power in being invisible and choosing to show up anyway. I used to believe that recognition was the destination. That if I could just reach a certain rank, a certain moment, then it would all feel worth it. But here's the truth. It was worth it long before the president said my name. It was worth it the night I signed my first classified mission. It was worth it every time I kept someone safe without them ever knowing they were in danger. The applause felt good. The standing ovation echoed in my chest. But it wasn't the thing that gave me peace. The peace came when I finally stopped needing to be understood in order to be whole. It came when I realized that I was never truly invisible. I was simply outside the frame they had built for me. And now that frame is gone. Now they see me. And that's healing. That's powerful. But it's not the foundation. The foundation was built in silence, in long nights, in lonely decisions. In every moment, I chose integrity over validation. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been told that your version of contribution isn't real, or strong, or worthy, if your family only values what they can measure, and your worth exists in the spaces they overlook, let me say this. You do not need to be seen to have value. You do not need to be understood to be honorable. And you do not need applause to be powerful. The world is full of people doing quiet, extraordinary things without credit, without spotlights, without recognition. You are not alone. You are not less. And when the day finally comes, if it comes, when the world turns and says your name out loud, you'll already know who you are. Because you've been carrying that truth all along. And that is more than enough.